Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning today's 3 Prakim Rambam. Hilchos Eidus Prakim 20, 21, and the final chapter of the series 22, starting with Perek Esrim. We are continuing to learn the din of Eidim Zoymim, and as we have explained, that when two people who say testimony in court, who they were properly, they made the chakira, the drishas, the bedikas, and they passed all these interrogations. And based on their testimony, gave a psak din. After they gave the psak din, comes along another set of witnesses, and they tell the court the topic about which they testified, we have no opinion on. We're not contradicting the event that they spoke about. But the witnesses themselves, imanu ha'yisem, in that time and in that place, they were with us. The Torah believes the second pair of witnesses, we believe them, which means now we know that the first pair of witnesses were liars. And the Torah says that whatever they conspire to do is to be done to them. And the Rambam will in this chapter go into much greater detail of exactly when do we apply that, the exceptions of these rules, etc. Perek Esrim has 10 halachas, beginning with halacha aleph. Ein edim zoymim bim neheragim. Whatever they conspire to do happens to them, which will also mean that if based on their testimony, someone was sentenced to death, they will be killed with that same death. So it says that Rambam that these lying witnesses are neither going to be executed, nor if they testified regarding someone who's chayiv malchus, they'll be chayiv malchus, or be required to pay ad. Here we begin with qualifications. Both of the first witnesses are indeed proper witnesses. They are kosher to testify. Number 2, we use shneim achar shenigmar hadin. That when it comes to capital cases, when it comes to all of these cases, they will only be held liable if Beis Din already gave a verdict. Aval, however, im huzam echad mehem bilvad, if only one of the witnesses became muzam, proven to be lying, or if both of them became Eidim Zoymim prior to the verdict, after the trial. Beis Din already accepted the witnesses, but they didn't actually render the verdict. It's important. That goes to all of the 3, Neheragin, Loikin, and Mishalmen. Shahuz Mushneim Achad Gmardin, even if they became Muzam after the Gmardin. But the Nimsa Echad Mehem Karev Apostle, we later discovered that one of them was not a kosher witness. So the din will be Ein Ne'em Noshim. This punishment, V'asisam Loi Kasher Zamam Lasois, will not happen to them. Afa Pisha Huzmu. And Huzmu to the point that now the Nifsalu L'chol Eidu Yeshivat Torah, in other words, them being known as lying witnesses with all of its consequences, that they'll never be allowed to testify again, that and the punishment don't always travel on the same track. They will become muzam, even if they were muzam koydem gemardin, but the punishment is only after the gemardin. Now, this statement is both by Neheragin, by Loikin, and Mishalmin. Halacha Beis is going to teach us a halacha unique concerning a capital case. Says that Rambam based on their testimony. Not only was there a verdict in a capital case, but that person, the defendant, was actually executed, and then they were discovered to be Eidim Zoymim. Says that Rambam, we don't kill them. The Eidim Zoymim are not put to death. Even though you can argue you have a din, you have a kal v'chomer, right? Ma'adach, if they only attempted to put the innocent victim to death through the Beis Din, after the Gemar Din, they will be put to death, is the chavada afterwards. We don't say that. That's called Ein Oinshin Min Adin. No, it's Shenemar, the Torah, the Pasuk in Shreiftim says, Kasher Zomam Lasos. The word Zomam means that they conspired. Conspired implies it didn't happen yet. Again, if it didn't even happen yet and they're so severely punished, certainly if they did something which is even worse, no, we don't make these dinim, we don't make al kal v'chomer when it comes to punishments. And And that's the way we know it from oral tradition. It's only kasher zama, but kasher ras. Avalam laka. But this qualification is only by capital cases. But if, based on their now what we know to be lying testimony, the defendant already got malchus, gemardin and malchus, and now they become Edom Zaymimim, they will be punished. Like in yes, not only do we rectify that mistake, and is the money returned to its owners, but on top of that, the Edom Zaymimim have to pay whatever it is that they caused them to already pay out. If when they come to court, they testify one after the other. But one after the other means prior to one. One concluded his testimony, the other one immediately began to say his testimony. So now we consider them to be one group. If v'husmu only miktsasan, which is quite amazing, ein ne'enoshim atsheyuzmu kulam. That's the rule. The punishment of vasisam loy kasher zamam is only if all of them become muzam. But that's only if they testified mamish one right after the other, immediately after the other. But if there was an interruption, even though it was relatively short, but it's considered an interruption, that's yasir b'chtei dibur. More than the time it takes to speak. What are we talking about? More than the time that it takes a student to inquire and to wish his Rebbe with peace. Now we say, we don't consider it to be one group. Now the opposite. The two that became Muslim will be punished. Which two? They ain't enosh. Now, what's very important to note is that even though the latter two won't be punished, but we won't rely on their testimony. Why batla ha'edus kula? In other words, when witnesses come to testify together, we say that if any one of them becomes invalidated for whatever reason, the whole group is invalidated. So it's amazing. But again, the din, are we going to be makabel the edus? No, we will not. Mitzad sheni, mitzad the din of Edom Zaymimim, we view the group that testified la'acher kedei dibur to be a separate group. So again, why do we qualify all of it? But nevertheless, the two that were betrayed kedei dibur will be punished if both of them became muzam. Halacha dalid heyid ho'echad v'nech dusay. If one person came to court and he testified and he underwent interrogation, for Amar Hasheni, the second person immediately says afterwards, Af ani kamoyu, or if he says the words hin, yes, which means I fully back up that which the first one said, and this indeed is a valid way of relating testimony. So now who's mushneim, if both of them become muzam, harei shneim neragim. If it's la'achad gmardin, before they put that person to death, or loikin, after the gmardin, whether they gave malchus or not. That's a rule that we're learning over here. Period. Another rule says that Rambam. Right, in many areas of Torah, most areas of Torah, there's a concept of a shoygig. That means that if I did something inadvertently, I'm not going to be punished. There is no such a concept when it comes to Edom Zaymimim. Even if they didn't know they're not allowed to lie, they will be punished. Lefi she'ein bahen ma'aseh. Now, why is that? Normally, we do differentiate between shoygig and mesid. Yes, we do. Because the Torah writes, Torah achas yelochem lo oise b'shgaga. The Torah associates this loophole, this leniency, when you did something b'shoygig. If it's a sin which is not connected to Maisa, then we are not machalik between shoygig and mesid. And therefore, says the Rambam, ein tzricha masra. Indeed, normally, why do you have to have forewarning? Kedei lahafchen ben shoygig lemesid. When Adam come to court, you don't have to warn them. You should know that if you will be caught to be conspiring witnesses, you will be punished. They don't need to be told that. Why? Because even if they don't know, they're going to be punished anyways. Why? Like we just explained. Because the only reason why we are machalik ben shoyeg lemezid, not only because it makes sense. Some mitzvahs make sense, great. It's because the Torah says lo oise bishgaga, and that's not a sin of mice. As we learned above in Perek Yudches. Halacha, hey. Kashem shashnayim azim en asameyam, which is also quite amazing. Im heidu hameya bekat achas. The Torah always believes the second group that says imanu hayisem, they are believed. You can argue, hold on, 100 people say that they were there in LA and they saw Reuven killing Shimon. 2 other people say that Reuven was in New York, which means the 100 were lying. We don't say, well, it makes more sense that 2 are lying, that 100 are lying. No, 2 have the power to reveal that 100 are conspiring witnesses. Which is mamash amazing. So if 2 people say they saw Reuven killing Shimon in LA, this group, Adam come and say those 2 were with us. 2 other people come and say we saw Reuven killing Shimon in LA. Those same people that said concerning the first group, Imanu Hayisem, the same 2 say regarding the second group, Imanu Hayisem, and the third group, and the fourth group, and the 50th group. We will always believe the second group. Ketzad, for example, a group of witnesses, Sheheida, that they testified al Reuven that they killed Shimon in Yerushalayim. Take back my LA, Yerushalayim. By saying you 2 witnesses, maybe Reuven killed Shimon, maybe not, that you were with us over there in Tel Aviv. That Reuven killed Shimon in Yerushalayim. Those same 2 gets up, same 2 that were Muslim the first group, they're Muslim the second group. And they did it to the third group, and to the fourth group, and to the 100th group. In all of these cases, kulam neragim, al pi hashnayim. Wow. Halacha vav. So group number 1 testifies Reuven killed Shimon. Comes along the second group. As we explained, and the Torah believes the second group. And in the scenario, in the window that we just spoke about, since it's a murder case, if Beis Din already paskened that Reuven is going to be put to death prior to killing him, if this happened, the witnesses of the first group will be put to death. But it's not just that the 2 witnesses, the Katri Shoina, will be put to death, but Reuven will be saved. Now, let's begin saying the following. What happens? Bokat Shlishis comes group number 2, and their Muslim group comes group number 3, Kat Shlishis, and their Muslim group number 2. Think about that. If we believe the last group that says Imanu Hayisam, so in our scenario, it means the second group were liars. The second group will be put to death. Why? Because their testimony was going to put to death the first group. But not only will the second group be put to death, but Reuven again is going to be put to death. Because since the second group were liars, that means the first group were saying the truth. They testified Reuven killed Shimon. So not only Teharigakat Shaniya, but also Reuven, who saved the Kat Rishayna. And this continues to go that way. Now if comes a 4th group, and they're Muslim the 3rd group, Halkop, so now Teharigakat Ashlishis, Gavaldik, and the Kat Rishayna, and Reuven is saved. And the second group is saved. And keep on doing that. We always will believe the final one that says Imanu Hayisem, and that will cause Kat Nechneses v'Kat Yotzam. One will be accepted, and one will be disqualified with the consequences, mamish, of people being sentenced to death, people being acquitted from a death sentence, and so on. Halacha 7. Eidim shehidu al ish treifa shaharag. You should only guess. Ish treifa means that there are certain bodily defects. We have these laws a lot more elaborated in animals. When it comes to shechting an animal, even though the shechita was kosher, the animal had, let's say, a hole in the lung. The animal is called treifa. That's the real meaning of treif. Even though the shechita took away tumas nevela, but you cannot consume that animal. There is the same concept on a person. A person who's treif, it means he has not an illness like cancer. It means he has a certain bodily defect. Something is lacking in his body to the point where halachically this person cannot live for a year, and he's called a treif. If we were to know that, just to know from the outset, such a person who's being accused of murder would not be put on trial. Why would such a person not be put on trial? We have to, well, let me word it differently. He can be put on trial to make sure that he doesn't kill other people, to protect the community. But the punishment that the Torah gives to a murderer can never happen to him. Why? Because if he'll be found guilty, that means that there was a verdict to kill a treifa person, which is not good, but you're killing a person who's going to die soon anyways. Witnesses are only accepted as witnesses if we can make them into Edom Zoymim. Meaning that if they are going to be proven to be liars, whatever they wanted to do will happen to them. We can't do to them what they want to do. They want to kill a treifa, they're not treifa. Having said that, as the Kesef Mishnah explains, the beginning of Halacha Zayin is, we don't always know that someone is a treifa. Many people can be a treifa, no one knows about it yet. This is such a case. No, it's the trial happened when no one knew that the defendant is a treifa. So someone was on trial, and the Beis Din accepted the testimony of group number one. Beis Din gave a verdict. Let's say, Reuven, you're found guilty. And now, after they gave the verdict, that group became Edom Zoymim. V'huzmu. The din is Ein Haragim. We cannot put them to death. Because, Shafilu Harugu be a Deim Ein Haragim. If someone kills a treifa, they're not put to death in court, because the person is already a treifa. Furthermore, if the witnesses are treif, both of them, all of misas Beis Din, and now v'huzmu, you also cannot put them to death. Why can you not put them to death? They were testifying regarding a man that's not treifa, because you have to have the possibility of being mazim, the edim that were mazim. Because, like we just mentioned, they were only mazim a treifa. You can't do to the second group of witnesses what you were going to do to the first, because the first are treifas and the other ones are not. So there's no din of edim zoymim. Halacha ches edim shehidu al echad. Witnesses testified regarding a person, and based on their testimony, which you'll discover to be a lying witness testimony, they found that person guilty, but it's a type of guilt. He was convicted in a matter for which there was no malchus as a penalty, there was no monetary penalty. Just one example that Rambam is going to give in a moment, just to say it out right now. They testified regarding a kohen that he's not really a kohen, he's a cholon. His mother got a divorce prior to him being conceived, no one knew about it. This is really a marriage which is in sin, and therefore this guy doesn't have a din of a real kohen. He can't serve in the temple. That was the verdict. The child, this person is not getting malchus, he's not being penalized with money. The witnesses are not even kohanim. And now they're proven to be lying witnesses. And again, the Torah says, do to them what they conspire to do. What are you going to do to the witnesses? So the rule is they're going to get malchus. When in many cases, as the Rambam will describe, when you cannot, there are 4 cases, when you cannot do to them what they conspire to do. By the way, some of the cases that we will mention, technically you could do to them. I'll tell you something, even if the Edom are kohanim, you also don't do that to them. They will get malchus, for example, and the Rambam is going to enumerate the 4 exceptional cases. Number 1, if they testified regarding a kohen that he's a cholon, meaning that they came and they testified that in front of us, this guy is 30 years old. 40 years ago, we saw his mother getting divorced. He was born by a woman who's now the father can be a kohen. Doesn't matter, but he doesn't have a din of a kohen, it's a din of a cholon. Or even if they're not testifying regarding an invalidation that's biblical, which is a child of a gerusha, but that his mother, prior to his conception, received chalitza. She was a widow. A kohen can marry a widow. Kohen gadol cannot marry a widow. A kohen can marry a widow, but not a widow that underwent chalitza. And she received chalitza. And they give a test and they say, like all other witnesses, it has to be mamakim pleni, b'yoyim pleni, makim zman, and now v'huzmu. So the din is like in another case, If they testify that Reuven killed someone, he manslaughtered, and based in Paskin that Reuven should go into Golus, for Huzmu, we don't say that that these witnesses have to go into Golus. We don't do that. You go into Golus only for manslaughtering and not for testifying and being found to be Edom Zainimim. What happens? They get punished. What's the punishment, Malchus? The Einon Goylim. Case number 3. If someone has an animal that killed a human being, as we learned, right, for the first 3 times, the animal has to be put to death. Now, how is it even shayach for it to come to 3 times? The animal escaped. If the animal does it on the 4th time, not only must this animal be put to death, but the owners, the gamba olav yumas, the imkoifer yushas olav, right, the nasan pidya nafshi, that the owner has to pay koifer money. So they testified concerning someone who was sentenced to pay koifer money. Now they're found to be zoymimim. They don't pay koifer money. They get malchus. And the final 4th case is heidu olav shenimkar be'evedivri. They testified that this person himself sold himself as an evedivri. We don't sell them into avadim. They don't become avadim. They don't become avadim. Says the Rambam va'arba devarim elon le'piyakabolim. Because some of them, actually, we know there has to be another punishment. Some of them you would think without the oral tradition. No, they testified that someone manslaughtered. You can send them into Golus until the Kohen Gadol passes away. We don't do that. Halacha 9. Now, the Chachamim received the oral tradition concerning a pasuk in Kiseit, say that verse is referring to these cases. If 2 people, based on their false testimony, made someone who's really innocent to be found guilty, and if it's a court case of 2 litigants, if you find the wrong guy guilty, that means you find the bad guy innocent. And afterwards, and they become zoymimim, and they set things straight. These are mamish words of the pasuk in Kiseit saying, right? So then, and the Torah says, bin. Not bin means if you'll understand that this is an exceptional case, hakois harasha. That there'll be times that the Edom Zoymim get Malchus, even if their testimony was not leading to Malchus. Now there's something else. If they testified that someone ate meat and milk that were cooked together, whoever did that is chayiv Malchus. If a person wears shatnez, the chayiv Malchus. If they're found to be lying witnesses, they will get Malchus. But that's not part of these exceptions. That's following the rule, do to them what they conspire to do. The pasuk in Kiseitze, which is a pasuk in Shleiftim, the pasuk in Kiseitze that we quoted, that is referring to these 4 exceptions. And the final halacha of this chapter, halacha Yud, Shnayim shehi'idu al Reuven, 2 people testified that Reuven seduced a daughter of a Kohen that was engaged. Now, the din is that normally when a man commits adultery, the general punishment of adultery is death by strangulation. There are some exceptions, right? If the woman is mikudeshes, then you get killed by stoning. And if it's with the daughter of a Kohen, then he gets killed by strangulation. She gets killed by burn. She's burnt. So what happens to these witnesses? It's based on their false testimony, there was a death sentence to 2 people. But it's different types of deaths. Which one do they get? The din is Reuven, the man, is going to be put to death by strangulation. Then Noyefes, the woman who got seduced, she's going to be put to death by Sreifa, which is the rule, the exception of a kohenes, of a bas kohen. Now the witnesses are found to be zoymimim. Says the Rambam, Hare elu nechnokim. They get death by strangulation and not by Sreifa.
Did that actually happen?
Sure did. And that's by oral tradition. And not because it says so explicitly, and not because we come to it logically, even though you can always then rationalize it, but this is what God said. All right, moving on to the 2nd chapter, today's 2nd chapter, which is the 21st chapter, Perek Echad Ve'esrim, of the laws of witnesses. And we're going to give many, many more details concerning Edom Zoymimim. This chapter also has 10 halachas, beginning with halacha. Every case here is going to be amazing. Two witnesses testify that a man divorced his wife. Listen to this, Yaron. And he didn't give her ksuba, which means based on their testimony, they're obligating someone to pay his wife ksuba money, and they become zoymim. Now, normally, what did we learn until now? We do to them what they conspire to do. Can't do this over here. You can't say, let's say the ksuba is $1,000. You can't say, well, let these two lying witnesses pay the man $1,000. No, because it could be that this man who Taka did not divorce his wife, could be he will. And when he will, he'll have to pay the $1,000. If he would have paid now based on their lying, false witness testimony, he would not have to pay twice. So you can't say that the mamish were going to cause them $1,000 loss. So you have to now know the formula. So how much do that? They have to pay money. The question is how much? Between today and tomorrow doesn't mean tomorrow. It means in the future. Could be the guy will divorce his wife. Could be he'll predecease her. When a man predeceases his wife, she gets from the state ksuba money. So we know how to monetize it. There is a simple formula, because a woman is allowed in her marriage to sell the future of her ksuba, which is a risk. So there is a way to monetize it. So how much will a man pay for any specific woman? The Rambam is going to say that every case is a case. It has a woman that's old and might die before him. Her ksuba is worth a lot less money. Another thing, sometimes you have a couple that everyone knows they're fighting like cats and dogs. There's a high chance of a divorce. The Rambam is going to write that. But there's a concept of a woman selling their ksuba, which is legit, no problem, because as long as it will cost money to the man to divorce his wife, whether the money goes to her or whether the money goes to whoever bought her note, it has the same effect of, if you're going to divorce your wife, it's going to cost money. Don't just by impulse get angry and divorce your wife. So one second. So we know how to monetize it. That money has to be paid. Now let me just say words and kind of, it takes time, but it's not that money is actually paid to him. The difference between the value of her ksuba, the real value, and the money she would have received by selling it right now, that difference, it's what's paid to the man. And like the Rambam says, every woman's ksuba has a different value. Because if the woman is God forbid ill, or if she's old, in other words, which means, don't forget, if a woman predeceases her husband, there's no payout to the ksuba. Or we have to know whether there's peace in between them, so there's a lesser chance of a divorce, or whether there's no peace in between them. That sometimes couples that fight the whole time, they can never get divorced. They need a fighting partner. It's not so pushing. Some couples that things are peaceful. What peaceful? They have no relationship. They don't even care to fight with each other. It's the end of the world. Sometimes fighting means at least you care. You're getting on the my skin. But every case is a case. If a woman is young and the husband is old, she's going to get her ksuba money at some point. At least you don't know how many years. Or if they're fighting. Another thing that Rambam says, which is a good rule when it comes to futures, it's never a percent. Let's say that if the woman's ksuba is $1,000, so a guy would pay for her a certain percent right now. That percent will not be the same if her ksuba is 10 times fold. As the Rambam will just give the words. This will be explained in a moment. If the ksuba is a lot of money in the ksuba, it won't be the same, even proportionally. For example, if the woman's ksuba is worth 1,000, let's say that people estimate that the chances of them getting that 1,000 is whatever it is, and they're willing to pay her now 100. In the case where, according to the circumstances, a guy would pay 10% to her now of 1,000, he would not pay 10% if her ksuba was 100. He would not pay her 10. Im hoisa meya, he would pay her less. It's not just about the proportion, it's about the number itself. So all of that has to go into account. Ela bepachus. The dvarim elo is something that the judges learn how to make these types of formulas. But again, the point is it's not that money has to be paid because you're not paying money to her. Their false testimony was not to her, was causing the husband to have to pay. So how do you monetize to the husband the difference between the real value and how much someone would have paid to her? Halacha number 2, in other scenario, 2 witnesses are saying that Reuven is chayv 1,000 and it's due in 30 days. The borrower is not denying the fact that he owes 1,000. That's not even the case for which he need. I owe 1,000, but it's only due in 5 years. At Chameshanim, 5 years after the 30 days. And they testified saying that he owes it in 30 days. And now they're found to be conspiring witnesses. Again, what do they have to pay? Can't say let them pay the 1,000 zuz. The borrower is going to pay the 1,000 zuz. You also have to make that estimation. We say, how much is it worth for you to be able to keep 1,000 zuz in your hands for another 5 years? That is the loss that they were going to cost to the Levite. I know we're getting into the whole, isn't that interest? Are we not allowed? Correct. But that's something that could be monetized. How much would a person pay? How much is it worth? We're not allowed to pay interest, but it has a value that the Torah says you can't charge. But how much has it a value? 2 people testify that the Reuven's ox gored. Now we learned that goring by a domesticated animal is considered some sort of unusual behavior. And for the first 3 times, the owner of the ox only has to pay half of damage. So indeed, if they're found to be zayimim, they only have to pay half damage. But let's go more than that. Even the half of damage is only if the ox that did the goring has that value of half. Chatzi nezek migufay. So therefore, ve'im ein asher l'shava chatzi nezek, then they only have to pay up to the value of the ox. As we learned in the laws of damages, she'ein mishalem ela migufay. And therefore, for example, but if they are testifying regarding someone's ox, that he did something that's not unusual, that's usual, like he ate produce, or he broke someone's property or someone's utensils while he was walking. These are behaviors for which you're chayv to pay nezek shalom from the first time. Indeed, mishalom nezek shalom. Now the rule is that if a person owns an eved and they knock out a tooth or a eye or any other of the 24 tips of limbs, so the din is that the eved becomes free. And therefore we also learned in those halachas that if a person, God forbid, hits his eved and he knocks out his tooth and then his eye, for the knocking out of the tooth, the eved is free. Now that the eved is free, when you knocked out the eye, you got to pay the eved the value, however you evaluated of knocking out his eye. So what were they going to cause this person based on their false testimony? That he would have to free his eved, the value of the value of the eye. Indeed. Or if they testified that in the opposite order, which would be at least less expensive for this alleged perpetrator, because a tooth is worth less than an eye. So if they said that he knocked out his eye, for that the eved goes free. And then he knocked out his tooth. What happens if it's true? We know that it happened, but it happened in the opposite order, which is that really first the tooth was knocked out and then the eye was taken out or made blind. So free, the eved will be free anyways. But based on their false testimony, the eved only would have gotten the value of the tooth. Really, he should have gotten the value of the eye. So they were going to cause the eved that difference. That difference is what they paid to the eved. Halacha 5. A woman can become a soita. How does he become a soita? When 2 witnesses testify that the husband warned her not to be secluded with a specific individual, and then the same witnesses or other witnesses testify that she was secluded with him. Even though no one knows what happened, she becomes a soita. So what happens if a bikina vestira and rendering a woman into a soita, they show huzmu, the din is loikin, they get malchus. And even though that's not one of the 4 exceptions that we learned in the previous chapter, but that is included in the pasuk of Parshas Kisitze, which is that when you cannot do to them what they conspire to do, then they get malchus. That's the default. Now the rule is that if a woman is already a soita, even though normally ein davar shebe'erva pachus mishnayim. Here, one witness will be believed if he says that he knows that she actually committed adultery. So if that one witness made that statement and that witness becomes muzam, he has to pay her ksuba because based on his testimony, she would lose her ksuba. Gewaldig. Ho shnayim heim eidi kinei vasira vatuma. Of the two people, they were the same eidei kinui. They were the same eidei stira. They were the same ones saying that during the stira or later, she actually committed adultery and it becomes zayin. So mishalmim keneged ksuba. They ain't like him. Question is, why will they not be put to death? Isn't their testimony going to cause her to be put to death? The answer is, hold on. Actually, for people to be put to death, they had to be forewarned prior to their act. And that's not what happened here. No, since de facto, all they would have caused for her is to wrongfully have lost her ksuba, so it's considered a monetary case for which doing to them what they wanted to do will mean they have to pay her the ksuba money. Halacha 6, if two witnesses testify on one individual that he stole, and he himself then either slaughtered or sold the animal, for that there is a penalty of 4 or 5-fold, and then they become zoymimim, they pay whatever, the 4 or 5-fold. What happens if two people say that so-and-so stole? For Geneva itself, if you take a stole, you have to pay the value plus the same, double. Other two witnesses say that after he stole it, he slaughtered it or sold it. Both of these groups become zoymimim. So the first group, who only testified b'negei Geneva, they have to pay kefil. The other group have to pay the difference between the kefil and the penalty. Now, if it's 4, then they have to pay another 2. If it was a case of 5, then they have to pay another 3, 2 or 3 times the value. Now, what happens if only the second group becomes muzam? So the second group now, but the ganef has to pay double. The ganef has to pay double. But the Edom, the latter Edom, they have to pay, like we said, 2 or 3. He's going to make his money back. Plus, what happens if only one of the second group becomes zoymim? Well, when one witness is out, then their testimony is nullified. Will they be penalized? No, they won't. If only one witness of the first group becomes zoymim, listen to what happens now. If you don't have kosher witnesses that this animal was stolen, you cannot penalize someone for slaughtering an animal. Maybe the animal was his. So then, batla kola edus, because and what's going to be amazing is that when only one of the edim becomes zoymim, they won't be punished, like we learned in the last chapter. You only do it if the whole of the group becomes muzam, like we mentioned. If they come bazach harzeh, but even if they were 100, we're only going to punish them if all of them become muzam. Halacha 7. Shnayim shehidu she'achal zeh sadazu shalishanu. As we learned in the laws of Toyin V'nitin, right, the difference between the Taltalin and Karka, that by Karka you only have a chazaka, not just by being now in the possession of the land. You have to have witnesses that back you up that you ate 3 consecutive years from this land, and you had such witnesses. And based on that, Beis Din was going to award the current occupant with ownership. And now these witnesses become zoymim. So exactly, Beis Din was going to award the current occupant with the ownership of the land, which means the real owner would have lost the entirety of the land. So mishalmin lebal asad demei asad. So that's simple. Now, what happens if the current occupant did not have one group that gave him the cheska shaloshanim? The guy that's living here right now brought one group that he ate there in year number 1, another group of witnesses that he ate there in year number 2, a third group that he ate there in year number 3. If all of these 3 groups, minimum 6 people, become muzam, what do we say? We say that they have to burden the value of the entire field, and to give it, they have to pay it to the owner. All together, they divide it amongst themselves. Are considered shalosh eduyos, Nevertheless, they are considered one as far as Hazama is concerned. And therefore, since they are considered as one, we're going to go into a tangent for a moment. What happens if you have three brothers? Now, we know that witnesses may not be relatives one to the other. Let's go back to the case where someone is currently in a field. He's claiming that he bought it. He doesn't have a document. The rule is that if he's there for 3 years, he gets to keep, right? The Chazaka backs up his taina. He doesn't have a normal 2 people testifying he was there for 3 years. He has 3 groups. But listen to how these 3 groups are comprised. There are 3 brothers, but they can never testify together. And then there's a non-relative. One brother testifies with the non-relative for year number 1. The other brother with the non-relative for year number 2. The third brother with the non-relative, the same non-relative for year number 3. That's the case over here. The echad mitzadavim kol echad ve'echad mehem. And each group testifies concerning 1 year. So now Yitaka have sholosh eduyois. It's only one benegeya hazama, but it's considered sholosh eduyois, which is good because if it would be considered one group, none of it will be accepted because you cannot combine brothers in one statement of testimony. But on the other hand, like we said above, but they are considered ke'edus achas lahazama, meaning that if all of them become muzam, then they all have to pay. But what's amazing is that how do they pay? 3 brothers together pay for half. The other one pays for the entirety of the other half, of course, because the other one was half of each year. So how does that ox become a muad? Because he gored 3 times. So now when he gores the 4th time, now the owner has to pay nezek shalom. Okay, so you have 3 groups. Each group testified concerning 1 act of goring. Now, then they are all exempt. All exempt means you can't say that they have to pay for nezek shalom because we need all 3 of them, like by Chazaka, to become muzam. For them now, he was not a muad. Nimsu shloshtam zoymemas. And based on their testimony, what would the owner have to pay? Now, for each act of goring, right, the first 3, chatzi nezek, but it never happened. So first of all, kulam chayav lo shalom chatzi nezek, afa pi shehutam, because during these 3, even though he wasn't yet a muad, but based on their testimony, they were machayev the owner to pay chatzi nezek. So each group has to pay the chatzi nezek. Shalom chatzi nezek. Now, bamed varam amurim v'shehoyu kulam roim zim zedzem. When they were motioning to each other, when we combined them together, or at least when they knew the owner of the animal, but they didn't know the ox. This is very important because when they come to testify concerning the ox itself, they know what the ox is. Then they're coming to testify concerning the act of nezek. They're not coming to testify that the ox is becoming a muad for you to combine them. If you don't know who the ox is, you don't know which one is the ox, and still they're coming to testify, don't forget, chatzi nezek, you can only pay migufa. If you don't know the gufa, the owner won't have to pay. The only reason why they're coming to testify is because the din is that if an owner, a baal, knows that in his herd, 1 ox is a muad, he has to make that extra protection on all of them. So it's their testimony is only to be mechayiv him to pay when the animal becomes a muad. If all of the above conditions are not met, if neither of them are, if any one of them are not met, then the first 2 groups won't have to pay anything. They'll say, we only came to testify for chatzi nezek. We did not know that the 3rd group was going to come and going to make him into a muad, which is gavaldik. And since they did not intend to make the animal into a muad, then they cannot become muzam. You were conspiring witnesses. Halacha tes. So if you remember the laws of Ben Soider Omeira, actually that's going to be Hilchas Mamrim. That's going to be in the next set of halachas. The rule is that this young person in that window, I think of 3 months, right? First, there has to be testimony that he robbed and he used the money and he had a tremendous amounts of meat and wine. And that first round of witnesses are Mechayev Malchus. If afterwards he repeats that behavior the second time, then he's going to be put to death. So what happens if that is only Mechayev and Malchus? Then comes along another set of witnesses, that he did the same behavior again, but now that he repeated it after the first time, that is the one for which he'll be chayiv to be put to death. And both of the groups become muzam. Here again, we have two sets of witnesses that are bringing the child to a certain phase. What do we do to these witnesses? Kato Rishoina, on whose testimony they were only mechayev to give malchus to this ben. Taka, they get malchus for ein and ereges. Because like we mentioned just above in Allah Ches, if they are saying a witness that has a specific effect, yeah, we do to them what they conspire to do. Not because this action was going to lead into a bigger scenario, they should be chayiv for the bigger scenario. We did not come to get him killed. We only came to give him malchus. But the second group will be put to death. Because indeed, sha'al piyam bilvad hu neret. Now, what happens? What happens if the second group was comprised of 4 people? 2 of them says that he stole, because it's that he stole, and with the money he consumed meat and wine, a lot of meat and wine. And 2 say befonenu achal. There we do combine them together, because if 4 people come together, even though 2 of them only saw the act of geneva, 2 of them only saw the act of achila, that is one group, and all of them are going to be put to death. Masha'en kain, when you have the katri shoyna that's about the first round of geneva and achila, that's only mechayev malchus. They can say, we didn't know there was another time. We don't care about the second time. Don't involve us in what you built on our testimony, which taka was machayev and misa. That's not on us. That's only on the kachaniyom. Another scenario in which if someone kidnaps a fellow Jew and then sells him, capital sin. But there has to be 2 steps, geneva and selling. So if 2 people testify that he stole, he kidnapped and he sold, which is based on their testimony, that defendant is found and was found guilty. And by the way, the punishment for that is chanika, strangulation. And as we learned in the beginning of the previous chapter, prior to Beis Din executing this alleged kidnapper, that Edom are found to be Edom Zoymimim. So that's the classic. However, what happens if you only have 2 people that testify that he stole, he kidnapped? Other 2 witnesses then come and say that he sold him. Now, based on all of these, based on the 2, what's going to happen? Then the Reuven, let's say Reuven, the person who allegedly did this, was sentenced to be put to death. Or only the Eidei Mechira, any group by themselves will be put to death. Wow. Not like by the Ben Seder Umayra, that the first group will only have to pay, only get malchus because their testimony is causing malchus. It doesn't work that way. Kidnapping is considered the beginning of kidnapping and selling. Kidnapping itself is the beginning of the chiyuv of misa. We view it that way. So even the first group by themselves will be put to death. 2 people testify. First, they don't know whether this individual was kidnapped, but they witnessed someone being sold, and they became muzam. If there was never witnesses that this individual that was sold was previously kidnapped, peturim. Because even if they would not have been muzam, someone testifies that Reuven sold Chaim, he's not going to be put to death for that. He's only going to be put to death if he first kidnapped Chaim. Because he can claim he was already my slave. What happens if afterwards, Bo Ede Geneva, and what do they say? And they say that he was stolen. But guys, the witnesses that claimed that he also stole Chaim, they were already Musam. Even if we see that they are in cahoots together, they're making signs to each other, they're motioning to each other. Since by the time that the Eidei Geneva came, the Eidei Mechida were already Musam, here ain't Eragim. Because the Eidei Geneva by themselves don't bring someone to death. Final halacha in this chapter, halacha Yud. I know we have a rule that ein loikin u'mishalmin. Normally, if a person sins, and that same act is machayev malchus, is machayev mammon, right? You don't get both penalties. Here we're going to see an exception to that. And here is the case. A man gets married, and the morning after the marriage, he's moitzi shemra al ishtoi, which means that he brings witnesses that his wife committed adultery while she was already an arusa. If those witnesses will turn out to be saying the truth, then this woman will be put to death. And period. Now, what happens if after he did that, the father brings witnesses that are mazim, the witnesses of the husband? So first of all, Eidei Habal Neragim. The witnesses of the husband will be put to death because based on this testimony, she would have been put to death. If now the husband brings Eidim, now another thing, when the father proves that the husband is lying, the husband has to pay, if the girl is a nara of that age, he has to pay her 100 silver shekel. So listen to what's going on over here. If now Chazal Behevi Habal Eidim, Vehezim Eidei Ha'av, now the Eidei Ha'av, we're going to put the Eidei Habal to death. That is what their testimony was going to cause to happen. And based on already sentenced on the Eidei Habal to be put to death. What happens if now the Eidei Ha'av are going to be found to be conspiring witnesses? Two things are going to have to happen because their testimony brought about two things. Number one, they have to be put to death. But they also have to pay the money to the husband, the 100 silver shekel. Obviously in the opposite order. After they die, they can't pay. They are going to be told to pay and then they'll be put to death. They're going to be put to death and both things have to happen to them. And comes out that based on their testimony, that it turns out to be conspiring testimony, lying witnesses, if someone is saying testimony that a woman and not a marasa committed adultery and then they turn out to be witnesses. Okay, but there's no penalty yet. But in other words, we don't know. The guy that committed adultery with another hamarasa also has to pay a fine for her father. But if the witnesses never testify who she is, then he never would have paid the fine because we don't know to who. We don't know who the woman is. But if they testified who she was, here also, both things have to happen. Because based on their lying testimony, they would have put her to death. And also they would have caused for the guy who committed adultery to have to pay money. Another case. So-and-so committed bestiality with an ox. Now, what happens is that whoever commits bestiality is put to death by stoning. Another thing is that if you know which ox is that ox also has to be put to death, which is a financial loss for the owner. So if the testimony did not identify the ox, and then they become huzmu, they're going to be niskolin, but they don't have to pay because they were not causing anyone to lose finances because they never identified the ox. But shoydoi shel ploini, if in their lying testimony in the beginning they also identified the ox, then both things will happen. Niskolin umishalmin, again in the opposite order. And today's final chapter, which is also the final chapter of Hilchos Eidos, which is the 22nd chapter, we will finally now introduce what we call Eidim HaMakchishim Zedzeh. So we already learned many chapters about Eidim Zoymimim. Eidim Zoymimim very importantly means that the second group of witnesses are not challenging the event itself. They're not saying, group number one is claiming Reuven killed Shimon. Group number two is saying Reuven didn't because Reuven wasn't there. That's not Eidim Zoymimim. Eidim Zoymimim is dafkem when the second group is not speaking about what the first group is saying. Maybe what he said actually happened, maybe not. They're saying that the witnesses themselves were not there to have seen it. The Torah believes the second group over the first. However, what happens if witnesses are contradicting each other? Group number one says Reuven borrowed money from Shimon in that time, in that place. Group number two says Reuven, the alleged borrower, was not there to have borrowed the money. Now, when you have such a thing, the Torah doesn't believe one over the other. They, so to say, cancel each other out. Now, Beis Din knows for sure that one of these two groups are lying witnesses. Just we don't know which one. Now we begin this chapter. And the first case will be, if you don't know which group is lying, if any one of these groups come independently for another case to Beis Din has to accept it. You can't, based on the suffix, say that they lost their ne'emanus. But what happens if there is a third case that is being based on one of the first group and one of the second group? One of these two are for sure liars. That testimony will be thrown out. Let's go. Halacha Aleph. If you have two groups of witnesses that are contradicting one of the other. In other words, it's not that Beis Din, the Torah says, believe the second over the other. One of them are liars. We don't know which one. So there's a question mark on each of these groups. Now, if one witness from group number one, if another one witness from group number two come together to testify regarding a third case, here, in Kanedus. Why? We don't know which one, but if you need to have two, you don't have two. One of them are liars. In contrast, if the entire group number one comes, both of them concerning a third case, and also the entire group number two come together in another case, in a fourth case, each case has to be accepted. Because every group has a cheskas kashrus. I know there is a question mark on each one, but until you prove otherwise, each one retains the cheskas kashrus. Halacha beis. Reuven shehoitzi al Shimon shtei shtaros. Guys, halka. Reuven has two documents against Shimon. Reuven is a lender. Shimon is the borrower. One document is attesting to Shimon borrowing, therefore owing. He has a debt of $100 of 1 month. The other document attests that he owes another 200 mana, and the kafar Shimon b'shtei shtaros. Shimon denies it all. Now, the eidei shtar zeh kat achas me'oisem hashtayim sheik chishud zu zu. The eidei shtar hasheni hakat hashniya. Each of these documents have witnesses. Now, Beis Din knows concerning the Eidim of document one and the Eidim of document number two that prior to right now, yesterday or last year or in the past, they contradicted each other. Which means, again, Beis Din doesn't know which group are not to be believed, but one of these two for sure are not to be believed. One of these documents, Taka, cannot be collected on. Now the question is, which document will that be? So we have a rule, right, that the Baal, whoever is holding onto the document, in this case the lender, has the weaker power. He's the moitzi. Harei Shimon will only have to pay the money. Now, the defendant will have to take an oath that he doesn't owe the other one before Beis Din ripping up the other one. Amazing. Now the Rambam says, I think, says the Rambam, that this oath that the defendant has to take, that he does not owe the other one, is not a normal shvuas hesses, but it has to be already b'nekitas chayfetz. Why b'nekitas chayfetz? Because it's similar to a moide b'mixas. Amazing. No, there are two documents against him. One of them he owes, he's denying the other one. We don't know which one, but one of these two documents are kosher, and they are me'idim on some of the money. Now, he denied both documents, but some of it we know he lied. This guy is already not so trustworthy. And if he himself would have admitted to owing part, he would have to take an oath. You can't make witnesses weaker. So it's not a shvua doiraisa, but it has to be a kein doiraisa, which is amazing. Come on, Shaviyah. Halacha 3. Reuven shtar Levi. Guys, halka. Reuven takes a document out against Levi. That Levi owes money to Reuven. The aid of kat achas mishteyem. Again, we are all using cases in this chapter that Beis Din already knows concerning two groups. One of them are liars. So one of these two groups are in this document. Shimon, another person now, he is another alleged lender to the same borrower. Shimon brings out a document on Levi. And on the document of Shimon, you have the other of those two Edom HaMakchish. Levi is denying it all. Gavaldik. Now what do you do? Now, there are two different lenders. I know that if it's coming from the same lender that Rambam already said, the rule, Yad Bala Shtar Ala Tachtoina, Reuven can only collect the 100 money. The other 200 documents after the oath will have to be torn up. Hold on. Over here, each group is saying, no, my document is valid. Here it's different. So here, the opposite. Here, Reuven, that lender, Taka has to take an oath, but he gets the money. Shimon takes an oath and he gets the money. Now the Rambam says even more, the fact that they have to take an oath is only midrabanan. And where is that based on? What is it similar to the case of the Chendani Alpin Kosai, beginning of Bava Metzia, which is that if you have a person that has credit in a store, his family buys from the Chendani and he pays, after you accumulate a certain amount of debt. So since the Chendani acts as his lender, this balabais tells the Chendani, I have a worker, pay my worker. What happens later if the Chendani, when he comes to collect from the balabais, says, including in the bill, I paid the worker, pay me back. The worker says, I did not get paid. The halacha is that each one takes an oath and the balabais has to pay both to the Chendani and to the worker. Mamish, same thing. And there we learned there has to be an oath when they are one in front of the other. That's where the Rambam gets the oath from. Halacha Dalet, Choitzi, Reuven Shtar al Shimon. Reuven pulls out a document against Shimon and the aid of Kat Achas Mehen. That's it. Reuven against Shimon. Now, V'hoitzi Shtar Sheni al Levi. Here, the lender is the same. The borrowers are different. Reuven loaned money, and therefore he's collecting from Shimon. Reuven is collecting from Levi. And each of these documents have two of these. Group number one, group number two. The aid of Hakat Shniya. And in this case, both Shimon and Levi are denying everything. Here we say none of them have to pay them. Because since because we know that one of them are lying witnesses, he cannot notarize them. Beis Din will not notarize them. Now they're kofer hakel, like any other kofer hakel. Both defendants, both Shimon and Levi, will have to take a shua sesses, and they will not have to pay. That's only when the two groups come together, when the two witnesses come together. But if you were not to come together, you come with one set, then you always will collect. And even if the same guy, like our Reuven, later pulls out the other document against someone else, against him, against someone else, then you will notarize the second document. In other words, as long as we don't bring them back together when you judge every case by itself, like we began this chapter, every group has a cheskas kashrus. Gewaldig. And the final halacha of this Perek, halacha hey, someone brings a, and they are interrogated. And v'huzmu, going back to the previous chapters. And this same guy brings more witnesses, making the same claim. And again, v'huzmu. Now, what does that give the appearance of? That this person is bribing witnesses. Even if it happened 100 times, if at the end he brings a group of witnesses making the same claim, and Beis Din was unable to be mazam them, and they passed the interrogation. In other words, this individual already has an established chazakah. That he knows how to bring false witnesses, but the final witnesses are not muhsak to be shakranim. That is because the Eidim are known to, the last Eidim have a cheskas kashrus, but if you have a document and there was a claim that the document is forged, how do we know the document was forged? Because two people come and say, this guy with this document asked for us to forge this document. Here, even if this document actually passed the authorization, the notarization, you cannot use this document to collect. Because we suspect, since this guy, we know from Adam that he attempted to forge this document, we have to be chayish that he succeeded. But that's only because you're basing the psak on a document that there's a question mark on it. But if the witnesses that signed on this allegedly maybe forged document, if they themselves come and they say, no, we signed this, then you could collect, like we had in the beginning of Allah Chayei. Because even though the owner, the Baal Ashtad, is taka muchsak to be a guy that's attempting to forge, but the Eidim themselves are not proven to be shakranim. And on that we say,